Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Has Religious Zionism Lost Its Way? Reclaiming Important Lost Voices with Rabbi Avidan Freedman. Rabbi Avidan Freedman completed a master's degree in Jewish education at the Azrieli Graduate School and received rabbinical ordination from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and from the Israeli Rabbinate. He's an educator at the Shalom Hartman Institute's high school and post-high school program, and an activist who founded Yanshuf, an organization dedicated to establishing moral limits for Israeli weapons exports. And I will put a link to the Yanshuf website in the chat in case you'd like to learn more. Rabbi Freedman, thank you so much for being here again with us today.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really it's a pleasure. It's good to be back with you all in the Valley Beit Midrash. I was here not too long ago, but it's wonderful to have this opportunity, and I really thank Rav Shmuley for inviting me. And I want to also take the opportunity to wish Shoshana, Rav Shmuley's wife, refuah shlema from her kidney donation, may our learning be a merit for her full recovery. Not that she needs more merits; she has plenty. But our learning should be a merit for Shoshana Kreindl bat El Tachaya, and also for Yosef Eliezer ben Shena Rezel. It's unbelievable. So if you've heard me teach before, you're going to recognize in a lot of my thinking, writing, and teaching of late, I feel like there's really one core problem or challenge that I'm relating to. One root disease that I'm reacting to, and each time I'm looking at a different set of symptoms. When I spoke last time about cheshbon nefesh, about the reckoning that Israeli society needs to be doing post October 7th, when I spoke the time before that in the Valley Beit Midrash about the appropriation of the hands of Esav, or when I've spoken about Israeli weapon sales to rogue regimes and bad actors, really the core is the same. If I put it into a verse from Zechariah, the verse is Lo b'chayil v'lo b'choach ki im beruchi. Not by strength, not by power, but by spirit. And if I put it into a word, the word is power. Power is a challenge. When the challenge isn't handled properly, then power becomes a corrupting virus. And my talk today is really just, our learning together is just one more chapter in this story. And it's a chapter about the transformation of religious Zionism related to this issue. It's a very personal chapter for me because I speak as an insider. I speak as someone who grew up and is still very, very much a part of the religious Zionist community, the religious Zionist movement, the religious Zionist ideology. And that's important for me to emphasize. Now, I don't know where everyone listening to this class, to this shiur is coming from. And I don't know how you're going to hear the things that I'm saying, because it's different hearing it from the inside, hearing it from the outside. Everybody has their own opinions, but it's very, very important for me to emphasize and to reiterate that when I come at this criticism, I'm coming from a place of desperate love and concern. I'm coming from as a member of the community, looking at my community and being concerned about what has become of it. From my perspective, it's a tragic chapter. It's a tragic story that I really hope can still have a happy ending. It's kind of the story of a character that it could have been the hero, or at least a hero of this story that we're telling about power. And it's a story where you have a hero. You know, these stories, these movies, maybe I'm sure you've seen or you've read something like this. You have a hero, and the hero has a potential antidote to the main problem, to the virus, and the tragedy is that the antidote actually ends up making the virus all the more severe. That's kind of the story that I want to tell with you tonight. So why do I say that religious Zionism could have been a hero of this story about power? When I'm thinking about power, when I look at the Jewish people's evolving relationship to political power in the last 100 years, there's a clear revolution that takes place. It starts to bud as far back as the beginning of the 19th century, but really evolves, and it becomes the issue throughout the 20th century. The Jewish people's relationship to political power is the question of Jewish peoplehood in the 20th century. So what's the traditional approach? The traditional approach to power, the traditional Jewish approach to power, which held for thousands of years, which was forged from the fires and the destruction of the Bar Kokhba revolt, we can call it quietism, political quietism. And Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch was an excellent spokesperson of this method, of this approach. It was his opinion. It was an opinion shared by most of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And it was also shared by the progressive Jewish community. And it sounds like this. He says, I have no interest in hidden things. For me, there is nothing better than to continue the well-trod path of our forefathers, who only placed before our eyes to be careful in all of our efforts to fix our own path in the way of Torah before God, and to raise up obstacles from before our hearts, and wait for redemption every day if we listen to his voice. They never put on our shoulders a path to redemption of strengthening and repairing the Holy Land, but only of strengthening and repairing our hearts and deeds in repentance. Meaning from the time of the destruction of the temple and the quashing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Jewish people are powerless, are scattered amongst the nations, are under the power of other nations. And the way out, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says, isn't by assuming the power. It isn't by taking power into our own hands. No. That's not the path to redemption. The path to redemption is to fix our deeds. It's to follow the Torah. It's to follow the ethics and the mitzvot of the Torah. And that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says, that is our path. And that's really, again, the mainstream Orthodox opinion, ultra-Orthodox opinion for 2,000 years, and also the Reform Judaism's opinion at this point in the 20th century. Who rebels against this, of course, is the Zionist movement. In Zionism, there was a fundamental rejection and rebellion against this approach. In rejecting this approach, really, they rejected 2,000 years of Jewish history. And to a great extent, not completely, but certainly at the extremes, rebelling against 2,000 years of Jewish tradition meant rebelling against any grounding in Jewish values. So this text is from a Zionist poet named Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, and he really takes this idea to the extreme, and he presents us with the opposite pole of the relationship to power. And he says the following: when the Jews return to the land of Canaan, right? He doesn't say Israel, the land of Canaan, and settle there as a nation, they must hold on anew to a thread that had already been severed by the prophets by their excessive morality. Meaning there was something in the Jewish nation that he accuses the prophets of Israel of severing this idea, this thread. Political and spiritual renaissance of the Jews as a nation, but as a Hellenic nation. What led me to this perspective, says Berdichevsky, is my final conclusion regarding the renaissance of the Jewish people as a nation, and the clear recognition that it can only be built on purely secular and idolatrous foundations. Literally, he says idolatrous. He doesn't literally mean going and taking idols, but he's saying it's not just about being secular. It is about rejecting the Jewish traditions, which aren't only, we're used to maybe the idea that in Zionism there was a rejection of the exilic traditions of the Talmud and all of the years following. And Berdichevsky takes it even a step more extreme. He says even the prophets of Israel had excessive morality. Now here is, again, it's an extreme expression. It's not, wouldn't necessarily say it's the mainstream secular Zionist expression, but an extreme expression of an idea of Jewish power, which says the exact opposite of what Rabbi Hirsch said. Rabbi Hirsch said, it's not about power, it's all about religion, it's all about faith, it's all about mitzvot. And Berdichevsky says it's all about power. The idols that he's talking about is really idolatry of power, and he embraces it. In other words, It's to say that we need to exercise our power, and we cannot be limited by the morality of Jewish tradition. If people are familiar with Nietzsche, he says similar things about power and about the way morality limits power. If you know Jewish music a little bit, so this idea is also, it's expressed in a lot of Israeli and Zionist songs. One of them is the famous song for Hanukkah, in which they sing, Nes lo kara lanu, pach shemen lo matzanu. Right? The Zionist movement stands for taking our power into our own hands. This is a song written in the 1930s. No miracle happened to us. We did not find a cruse of oil, meaning we are the Maccabim, but for us, we're not we're not relying on miracles. We are taking our fate into our own hands, and that is our approach to power. So we have two poles, two extremes for how the Jewish people related to power throughout the exile and then the rebellion of the Zionist movement. Between these two extreme views of power, enter the ideology of religious Zionism. Enter our potential hero, as it were. And what's actually really fascinating is that the view of religious Zionism wasn't presented as a reaction to these two poles and a synthesis between these two views. It actually preceded the rebellion of the secular Zionist movement. Rabbi Yehuda Alkali lived from 1798 to 1878. Theodore Herzl's grandfather and father prayed in Alkali's synagogue in Zemlin in Serbia. And here he's quoting Rabbi Yehuda Bibas from Gibraltar, who had been inspired by seeing the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. And he believed that the Jewish people should draw inspiration and needs to do the same. So that's this Zionist idea of power, of rebellion, but he roots it in Jewish tradition and in Jewish texts. And he says the following: "Return to me and I will return to you," quoting the verse. And the Gemara says, the Talmud says, all of the set times of redemption have passed. And now redemption only depends on repentance. Because the fasts, the generations have become weaker. We don't have the strength. And if we say praying with intention in our great sins, we have no one who knows how. So he's saying all of the way, how do we do tshuva? How do we return, right? This is the period at the time of the year of tshuva. So one of the ways you return is we say we fast. Well, he says, you know what? Our fasts these days are not as powerful as fasts once were. And one of the days that you do tshuva, you repent, is by prayer, right? Tshuva, utfilah, utzdaka. So it's prayer. But he says, we don't know how to pray we don't do it like they used to. And so he says this return, this tshuva, has not been accomplished in 1,770 years. What do we have to do now? If so, is our hope lost? God forbid. He says, you know what? If redemption depends on tshuva, and we've been doing all of these things for 1,770 years, do we really have a chance? We're not getting better at it, he says, right? If our repentance is about our deeds, it's about our prayers, if it's about our fasts, all of those things we're actually in a downward spiral. We're not getting better. So does that mean we've lost our hope? And here he quotes from Ezekiel, Avda tikvatenu. It's the same quote that Naftali Hertz Imber uses when he crafts Hatikva. Is our hope lost? And so he says, no, hope is not lost. Rather, the meaning of the matter is the return of Israel to its land. What does tshuva mean? It literally means to return physically. And this is what God says, return to me and I will return to you. When you make the effort to ascend to Jerusalem, even if you are in distress, when we show that our soul yearns to be protected by God's divine presence, immediately God's mercy will be awakened and his redemption will be revealed speedily and in our days. So what is Rav Alkali, Rav Bibas, what are they saying here? Samson Raphael Hirsch had said, it's all dependent on our good deeds. We're not meant to take political power into our own hands and to act in the political field. And these rabbis say, no, tshuva literally means return in the physical sense. The Jewish people are meant, the Torah, God wants us to take our fate into our hands, to take ourselves up to Jerusalem, and then and then God will respond. Another one of the early pre-Zionist thinkers was Rav Tzvi Kalisher, also the beginning of the very beginning of the 19th century. And he rejects passivity as well. But let's just take a look at his endorsement of power, because it's significant how he says it. He says the following: remove the mantle of habit from yourself. Most people think that in a moment the Messiah will cry out, blow the great shofar to arouse all the denizens of earth. It will not be so. For the beginning of redemption will be by the awakening of generous spirits and the desire of nations to gather some of the scattered of Israel to the Holy Land. So Rav Kalisher does endorse the return to power. He does reject the quietism that had typified traditional Judaism for 2,000 years, but he is less militaristic even than Rav Bibas, who really wanted the Jewish people to take up arms. And he says, yes, we need to do it actively, but it's going to happen how? By generous spirits, by Rothschilds and Montefiores and people like that taking money and going and buying the land. And it's going to happen by the nations agreeing to gather the scattered of Israel. We're not going to go and rebel and take up arms against the Ottoman Empire. We're going to get the assent of the nations. And yet still, here is religious Zionism. In other words, a Zionism that is deeply rooted in religious texts and values, not rejecting them, that is coming and saying, this is our relationship to power. Yes, on the one hand, we embrace it. We re-embrace what we had not taken part in so long. On the other hand, you already see in Kalisher that there are going to be limits to this power. So you have this potential synthesis within religious Zionism. And I want to emphasize, this isn't about orthodoxy this isn't about Orthodox religion. This is a religious idea, which was also a religious idea which was expressed by Echad Ha'am. So it's not about a specific denomination of Jewish practice, but it's a religious idea as opposed to a secular idea in the sense of this relationship between the Jewish people and the Torah and God. And also it's a religious idea that stands as opposed to the idolatrous idea of Berdichevsky, where you completely reject not only God, but really any kind of moral limits to power. Between the Zionist rejection of passivity and the endorsement of our own ability and the religious endorsement of passivity, you have religious Zionism, but with a certain skepticism and a certain criticism of power and a certain limitation of power. And so when you put these together, you get a voice that sounds like this. Now, the document we're going to look at now is really, it's remarkable. It's a remarkable statement with a remarkable story behind it. This is, I'll give you a little bit of the historical background. This is a declaration of the chief rabbis. It's published in the Davar newspaper, November 17th, 1937. What's going on in Palestine in 1937? We are in the midst of the great Arab revolts from 1936 to 1939. We're in the thick of it. There are Arab terror attacks against the Jewish residents of Palestine all of the time. And there's a debate raging within the Yishuv about how to respond to these attacks. The official policy of the Yishuv and of the Haganah was called Havlaga, was called restraint, meaning we are not going to respond violently. We are going to defend ourselves, but we will not respond violently, and we certainly will not go and take revenge against innocent Arabs. We're going to put the responsibility for taking care of this uprising on the British forces who are supposed to be in charge here. The revisionist Zionists, the Irgun, on the other hand, rejected this. They called for indiscriminate acts of revenge against the Arabs. It's what we would call today price tag attacks, Tag Machir. Now, we have to understand, there were only 370,000 Jews living in Israel at this time. 500 Jews were killed during this period of attacks. Okay, let's understand the numbers for a minute. If you convert the percentage of the population then that was killed to our population now, that would be 10,000 people killed, right? 500 out of a population of 370,000. If we think about it in our terminology today of 8 million people, 10,000 people killed. And it's not just a question of numbers, right? The political significance of the revolt is very, very clear. The reason that the Arabs are uprising is because there is British support for a potential Jewish state. And the revisionist argument was a very logical, sound argument. They said, we cannot show weakness. The only language that the other side understands is force. Our very existence is really on the line. It hangs in the balance. If we can, again, translate it to nowadays and what the sense of existential threat that we feel, and you think in 1937, what kind of an existential threat people needed to be feeling, and yet, in this debate about how to react, this is the religious Zionist statement. The chief rabbis, Yaakov Meir, the Sephardic chief rabbi, the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel under the institution of the Israeli chief rabbinate, and Yitzchak Halevi Herzog publicized this declaration to the Yishuv, our dear brothers, in the name of our holy Torah, the foundation of our existence throughout all generations and times, in the name of the honor of our people that remains faithful to its noble commands, we turn again to all parts and corners of our nation in every language of request and warning. Remember the stone from which you were hewn. Bring to heart our trials for the last thousands of years, that our people withstood without abandoning for a moment the purity of our attributes and our ethics, our lives and the length of our days. Do not stray from this secure and pure path during this time of testing that we hope is the last of our redemption. And there should not be even one who separates himself from the community to give himself to the aspirations and poison of acts of vengeance and murder. The chief rabbis are saying the Jewish people throughout history have suffered so much, but throughout all of our trials and tribulations, we have always remained faithful to our own ethical commitments and commands. We have always remained faithful not to spill innocent blood. The chief rabbinate of the land of Israel, the highest religious organization of Jews in the land of Israel, encourages all community leaders in their powerful decision to continue the policy of restraint until the end. Again, we're at 1937. We don't know what's going to be. They said this is literally Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. We are willing to die for this value. We invite all rabbis in the land, each in his place, to give their hand and their influence in this direction, whose foundational source is the Torah, whose paths are paths of pleasantness, and all its ways are peace. Now, there was also a political argument for havlaga, for restraint. There was also a pragmatic argument for it, but that's not the argument that the chief rabbis are making. They are making an ethical argument and a religious argument rooted in religious text. If we're talking now about religious Zionism losing its way, for me, this is a text that just it stops me in my tracks. It throws me off my chair. The difference between this statement and statements coming from religious Zionist leadership, both political and rabbinic leadership, these days in the past year, about revenge and about there not being any such a thing as innocent, it's just heaven and earth. I mean, it's really remarkable the difference. Now people might argue the revisionists were right. There's a good argument to be made. The revisionists were actually right. After all, what was the result of the Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939? What ended it? The British gave in to the Arabs, right? They gave in. The Arab violence won, and the British passed the white paper, which stopped Jewish immigration, meaning the Arabs didn't want the Jews to be able to come and to settle the land in order to create a state. They attacked innocents, The Jews held back, they were restrained, and they lost. The white paper was passed. Jewish immigration was made illegal. The British capitulated. The argument was right. It was really correct. And that is what makes the next text that I want to see with you all the more incredible. Because now I'm going to bring you forward a few years to after the white paper is passed to see, well, given the white paper, have people changed their minds? Are they now going to, is the mainstream religious Zionist or Zionist opinion now going to fall in line with the revisionists and say, yes, we were wrong. We needed to be more powerful. We needed to attack them. We shouldn't have been so, they say in Hebrew now, yefei nefesh, so such puritanical, moralists. So let's see. These are the words of Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel. And he is now in 1939, the next Sephardic chief rabbi. He has replaced Rabbi Yaakov Meir. And this is a text which comes from a compilation called Neged Terror, Against Terror. It was published in August 1939, a few months after the white paper was passed. It's clear the argument that we just mentioned is being made, right? The argument of the revisionists is being made not only in words, but also increasingly it's being made in deeds, meaning people after the white paper are saying, forget this, and we need to take revenge. The revisionists, the Irgun is doing it. Even in the Haganah, there are some who are doing it out of, despair. There was some more support for acts of indiscriminate revenge. And in reaction to this, there's a fascinating figure who went by the pen name of Rabbi Binyamin. Look him up if you've never heard of him, Rabbi Binyamin. And he initiates a declaration. He's a religious figure, very, very interesting. And he initiates a declaration signed onto by hundreds of public leaders and authors and rabbis that says simply, Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not kill. And it reiterates now in 1939 the exact same sentiment that we expressed above, despite the white paper. So this is the very short essay after there was kind of a declaration that was published in the newspaper. And then there's this compilation of short essays of many of the signatories onto this letter to give a deeper voice to what they're saying. So this is Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel. And he says, it's such a great text that we just want to see it all with you. The severe mitzvah, the mitzvah of shedding blood, which denotes the nature of Judaism, right? It gets at the very crux of what it means to be Jewish, was kept by the Jewish people in all its sanctity from the time it was a nation and in every situation it found itself. Like our forefather Jacob, every Jew was equally concerned lest he kill and lest he be killed. Here, Rav Uziel is referring to an interpretation of the prayer of Jacob when he's about to meet Esau, he's about to meet Esav. And it says in the Torah, it says that Jacob was fearful and he was afraid. And the rabbis say he was fearful that he would be killed and he was afraid that he would kill. As much as the Jewish people protected itself from being killed, it guarded itself with equal zeal not to kill. This honorable quality of Judaism was revealed in all its glory in our settling of the land during the last years of upheavals that still continue in all of their ugliness. In other words, Rav Uziel says, we weren't really tested in this test of power for a long time, but here now we have proven ourselves during this Arab revolt. The Jewish settlement, the Yishuv, proved how committed we are by not going and killing innocents. We suffered much anger and terrible pains. Many precious, pure souls were murdered with the shovels of bloodthirsty, cruel murderers who had no pity on the elderly or the young. They slaughtered mothers with their children, killed Jewish sisters that had faithfully served in treating their injured. These were Jewish nurses who treated Arabs and then were killed. They uprooted plantations, ignited produce, burnt many buildings. All this we suffered with self-restraint of incredible strength. Rav Uziel says this is a note of honor for the Jewish people, for our commitment to lo tirtzach, to thou shalt not kill, that despite the barbarity, and again, for me, I certainly hear the echoes of our experience over the last year, despite a barbarity of terrorist actions, we maintained our own commitment. The fear of terror in all its might never scared us. We did not hide in our houses. We did not stop our work despite the danger of ambush and death which surrounded us. And when we needed to, our sons fought with valor and showed everyone our ability to meet the enemy at the gate. Meaning, Rav Uziel is not against self-defense. He's not saying that it's not legitimate to bear arms in order to defend yourself. Of course, that's the Haganah. Everyone agreed with that. But here's the critical point. Above all, we maintained our unique character, not to spill the blood of the innocent. Right? This was the dividing line between those who were calling for revenge and would go in and would kill indiscriminately. And he said, we, in general, the Yishuv, and now this is the call he's making, we maintained our unique character not to do this. Even our enemies in spirit walked through our streets and settlements in tranquility, and no one attacked them in deed or even in word. Now here he's relating exactly to the sentiment of, well, you know, people who are not terrorists are supporting terror. So they're terrorists, they're supporters of terror, they're potential terrorists. And Rav Uziel says, you know, our enemies in spirit, meaning we know that there are Arabs who are walking our streets who agree with this, who are against us, who are our enemies. But it is our mark of honor and pride that they walk in tranquility, that they can walk through our streets without being attacked, in deed or even in word, even in word. With pride, we can say our hands were not desecrated by the blood of the innocent. So this is the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel speaking. Rabbi Herzog also has a text within this compilation, and he speaks similarly about how proud we need to be. He said he was the chief rabbi in Ireland. He says, I saw what happened in the Troubles in Ireland, and the way that we behave is something completely different. It is what Judaism is all about. Now, we said that in the short term, it did seem like the revisionists were right and that the Zionists had lost. But the truth is that when you look at the long-term picture, the policy of restraint proved itself. The Arabs lost legitimacy and lost support because of their actions, and the Zionists maintained the support of the British, which ultimately does translate into our ability and of the nations of the world to establish the Jewish state. If we had followed the short-term policy of the revisionists, it could be that we would have showed them who's boss and we would have killed more people and we would have showed our power. But it could very well be that we would have not only lost our pride and our commitment to our values, but along with that also lost our legitimacy in the eyes of the nations and our ability to create the Jewish state. So that was then, and this is now. When you fast forward 100 years, it literally pains me, physical pain, to acknowledge that nowadays you're more likely to find a rabbinic letter like this one. This was a rabbinic letter signed on by many, many names of many major significant rabbis within the religious community, which comes to advocate for a convicted Jewish terrorist, Amiran Ben Uliel, convicted by a Jewish Israeli court of killing a mother, a father, and their 1.5-year-old child in Duma. I remember when that happened and the first story of it came out, it was so awful. I was just praying. I was praying. I remember saying to one of my children, I don't think this is something that Jewish people can do. But it was. He was convicted for it. And you know, here they could say the people who signed on to this letter might say that they're opposed to testimonies extracted under duress, or they're actually opposed to not to the conviction, but to the inhumane conditions of imprisonment that this murderer is facing. But you can't really make that claim. The letter was organized by a group and it's signed on to by rabbis who they may or may not believe that Amiran Ben Uliel committed this murder, but at the end of the day, they support these kinds of acts of terror. It's not everyone who thinks this way. It's not the entire religious Zionist community that thinks this way, but I, again, as a member of the community, I'm forced to recognize, and I think it's to be blind not to recognize, that was once a position that was once a marginal fringe opinion has become the mainstream. And what was once the mainstream has been all but silenced. Because the people, the rabbis, if there had been a rabbinic letter in response to this letter, signed on by more rabbis and signed on by the chief rabbis, that would be one thing. But there was a few peeps here and there that expressed opposition to this, not nearly enough. Now, unfortunately, I could go on for hours with examples of this, but we don't have the time. I don't have the stomach for the kinds of acts of terror, of violence, of violation of the Jewish values that we saw expressed by Rav Herzog and by Rav Uziel. A question that has to be asked is, how did this happen? How did we get here? But I also don't have really the time today to get into that. That deserves maybe a seminar in and of itself. Today, tonight, for me, what's more important than explaining why religious Zionism has lost its way is really to highlight some of those lost voices that show us it wasn't always this way, and it doesn't need to remain this way either. The resources are there, the voices are there, the texts are there. And I want to end with one more very, very important figure and take one point from him as a beginning thought to answer the question of where did things go wrong and how did we get here? This is Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel. Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel was voted in as chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in 1935. He beat out Rabbi Herzog, who then became the chief rabbi of Israel, and he beat out Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, if you've ever heard of him. But as opposed to those two names, Rabbi Amiel is barely heard of. But he's someone whose voice must be heard, especially nowadays. And he writes a book in 1943, Linvuchei HaTkufa, for the perplexed of this time. And there he sets out two models of Zionism. He says there is Zionism of hatred and there is Zionism of love. He says like this: the foundation of Zionism of hatred is that wars between peoples is something natural and necessary, and thus will it be forever. Power is what rules in the world, and justice is something only good for nothings adorn themselves with. Whoever has power, justice is theirs. And if we want to exist in this world, it is enough that we be a power in this world, in the simple sense. For this, too, is a great principle, says this Zionism of hatred, that the powerful hates the weak. And that is why the nations of the world hate us. This is the Zionism of hatred. Essentially, it's a Zionism of power. So again, here is where I return to that theme that I mentioned at the beginning, like a broken record. When I listen to so much of the rhetoric coming from the religious Zionist leadership today, this is the kind of Zionism that I hear. The idea that we're doomed to wage wars and we're always going to wage wars, and that we need to, the Goyim all want to kill us and that they all hate us and we're a nation that lives alone, and anti-Semitism is, and this is the tragedy, because this is the tragedy of this potential hero of religious Zionism, because in his time, Rav Amiel was actually criticizing secular Zionism. His criticism was that this is an idea that does not have its roots in religion. This is an idea that goes back to Berdichevsky. This is an idea that sees all of the world as just a picture, a question of power. That's fundamentally not a religious way of looking at the world. But in our day, this isn't the approach. This power approach in philosophy and politics has been appropriated by the religious, and they've placed a big knitted kippah on it and put big payas on it, and that's where it is. Rav Amiel thought that religious nationalism is fundamentally different, and he says this. He says, the foundation and root of a Zionism of love is the image of God in humanity. That's the root of religious nationalism. Selem Elohim, the image of God, not in Jews, in all of humanity, and the absolute spirituality of all things, which replaces the I, of course, egotism. He says that the secular idea of nationalism is an egotistical idea. We want to take care of our own tribe. That's what we need a nation for. Okay. But he says religious nationalism, there's a different I. I am the Lord your God. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. The ultimate goal of our nationalism, therefore, is not self-centered. It's not just about the Jewish people. It's a universalistic vision. In the end of days, all nations will stream to it. We will not close our gates or ask for a visa of any, right? We're familiar with the law of return, Chok HaShvut, which says any Jew can come. But Rabbi Amel says the religious vision of Zionism is that there would be a Chok HaShvut for all peoples, for all Jews and non-Jews. They could all come. We won't close our gates. That's what we want. Our nationalism is founded in love, the love of Israel for God and for all who are created in the image of God. Our national existence will only be guaranteed if we walk in our ancient path, the method of love instead of hatred of the whole world, the method of belief in the victory of absolute justice over evil and wickedness, out of a recognition that in the end, the idols will be cut down. Go back to that idolatry of Berdichevsky, including the idols of nations and the idols of classes. This was our war strategy in the exile, and it needs to remain our strategy in the land of Israel. Or more correctly, it is precisely in the land of Israel that we need this strategy even more than in the exile. It is precisely, Rav Amiel says, when we return to political power, that we need to be sure, if I return to my class a few times ago, not to adopt the hands of Esau, of Esav, not to adopt a philosophy that is all about power, but to adopt a philosophy that is rooted not in hatred and in fear, but in love, not love only of God, not love only of the Jewish people, but actually love of all of humanity. And that commits you to morals and actions like not shedding innocent blood. And Rabbi Amiel says, our existence depends on this. It's not like they argue that if we're soft and if we're so moral, then we are endangering ourselves. No, he says, just the opposite. This is what our existence depends on. So these are religious Zionist voices from 100 years ago who said these things in circumstances really no less difficult and no less scary and frightening and existentially threatening than we live in today. And just to finish, I want to bring one voice from within the religious community today, which is saying things like that. Again, I have to admit, it isn't the voice that you hear from the political leadership of the Religious Zionist Party, for sure. It's not the voice that you hear from the rabbis associated with it. It's not a voice that you hear powerfully enough from rabbis who might agree with it. But there are still these voices. And this is Michal Chernikovsky, who is part of a leader of a movement called Hasmol Ha'emuni, the Faithful Left, and in general, an amazing activist. And she gives, I think she perfectly exemplifies what a Zionism rooted in Tselem Elokim during these difficult days might sound like. And with this, we will end. We'll share one more story afterwards, and then give a little bit of time for questions and comments. She says, since the 7th of October, voices that proclaim it's us or them have been strengthened in Israel relative to the Israeli-Palestinian story, as though our life is dependent on their death. Based on this perspective, if we want to live here, they either need to leave or to die. Also, among the Palestinians, the idea that their lives depend on our death or expulsion is widespread. Right? You have it on both sides. But the story of the hostages completely upends this theory and illustrates just the opposite. Our lives are contingent upon Palestinian lives, and their lives are contingent upon our lives. Right now, as it stands, she actually wrote this even before it was so true or so apparent. But right now, a ceasefire and the return of the hostages are intimately connected to one another. The care for all lives, the concern for all lives, Jewish lives and Palestinian lives, really come together. This is a Zionism that is rooted in Tselem Elohim, rooted in love and concern for people. One of the songs that is frequently sung in the religious Zionist world goes like this: Am hanetzach lo mefached miderech haruka. The nation of eternity does not fear the long path. There's a great story I want to end with from the Talmud about Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. And he says, in all my days, no person defeated me except for a woman, a young boy, and a young girl. And then he gives an incident of each one. And what is the incident with the young boy? One time I was walking along the path. I saw a young boy sitting at the crossroads. And I said to him, on which path shall we walk to get to the city? He said to me, this path is short and long, and that path is long and short. I walked, Rabbi Yeshua says, on the path that was short and long. When I approached the city, I found the gardens and orchards surrounded it. I went back and said to him, my son, didn't you tell me this way is short? He said to me, and didn't I tell you that it is also long? Classic Jewish children's chutzpah. I kissed him on his head and said to him, happy are you, O Israel, for you are all exceedingly wise from your old to your young. There is a short path which is long, and there is a long path which is short. Power very often tempts a person to take the shorter, longer way. We know this is true in relationships. It's true with parenting. No, we do something, zabang, we exert power and we get our way, but we know that we won a battle and we lose the war. If it's with our significant other, if it's with our children, if it's with students, it's true in politics too. We think we've accomplished something, but we end up in a dead end. And the way this story plays out as far as religious Zionism and religious Zionist community ideology, I think is a microcosm. Again, this is one chapter in how this story is playing out in much broader ways in Israel, in Israeli society, and indeed in the world. When we are willing to listen to the voice of the child, we might be able to be willing to relinquish some of our power and then to work through the longer, shorter way. So I bless us all during this time of cheshbon nefesh, of introspection, that we merit to walk this path without fear, that we appreciate and find the lost voices, the resources within our tradition to give us the strength to truly walk the longer path of the eternal nation. Thank you so much, and I'd be very, very happy for a few minutes, for 10 minutes, to take any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you so much. Yes, we'd love to take a couple questions or comments. If anyone would like to speak, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on people. And you can also write questions in the chat as well if you have them. I know there was a question, I think, from Judith about the Holocaust, but then we kind of touched on that time period. Was your question answered, or did you have something else that you wanted to ask?
So I had two thoughts. One is that in the Chumash and the original conquest stories, God instructs the Israelites to do an awful lot of killing and destroying, really irrationally so almost. That was one phase of time that occurred to me. And the other was the Holocaust. I'm a child of survivors, myself born in a displaced persons camp, and very personally know the story of Jews without power. And Israelis, of course, having, in a sense, demonized them as having gone like sheep to slaughter maybe by adhering to that sense of themselves that we don't do that. We let it be done to us, but we don't do that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pose those two.
Yeah, so those are two. Each one of those points really deserves at least its own hour-long shiur, if not, again, its own seminar. But just on one foot, I would say that the question of the morality of the Jewish people's conquests back then is it's a big question, but well, let's say one thing that we can simply say. I don't think back then, I don't think it was actually irrational. I think it was very rational, and I think it was very normal. Back then, that's how the world worked. The Jewish people weren't doing anything different than anybody else was doing. Just like when the Jewish people were having slaves, they weren't doing anything else different than what other people were doing. and that's something that's endorsed by the Torah. And just like the patriarchy and inequality against women is something that was endorsed by the Torah. That was then, and for all of those questions, we need to think about and to face how do we apply the Torah properly in our day and age. One of my fundamental understandings of the Torah as far as ethics, and it goes back to the Talmud, is that it can never be the case that Jewish law sets a lower standard of ethics than the general world. So if the world has adopted the Geneva Conventions, which, by the way, were adopted specifically coming out of the Holocaust and out of our experiences. The definition of genocide was created by a Jew who had looked at the Armenian genocide, but then at the Holocaust. If that's something that the world has accepted, it cannot be that the Jewish people set for themselves a lower moral standard. And that's something with roots in the halacha and with roots in Jewish thought. As far as the second, as the second point regarding the Holocaust, I would really recommend, if you've never read it, to read the essay of Rabbi David Hartman. That's for me, it's a word from my sponsor because I'm a Hartman employee, and he has an amazing essay about Auschwitz or Sinai, about two different paradigms. What is going to be our paradigm for Jewish power? Is it going to be really, it sits on the same category of Rav Amiel's Judaism of hatred? Is it going to be this idea of everybody hates us and we need to have power in order to defend ourselves, and in Auschwitz, in that fear, in that existential fear? Or is our organizing paradigm going to be Sinai, going to be a Zionism of aspiration, of values? That Zionism doesn't deny the need for power to defend ourselves. That is legitimate and that is a moral use of power. But it does say that, again, something that is an accepted truth in international humanitarian law, even if it's not obviously practiced 100%, but this is the way the world speaks, and these are the norms that are accepted. Even as you wage war, there are demands of how to wage just war. In other words, it's not enough that the reason for going to war is just, but the way that you wage war also must be just, where the main pillar of that is to discriminate and not to intentionally attack innocents. Hartman has a very powerful statement in that essay. He says that people who adopt the model, the paradigm of Auschwitz, people who essentially say that our existence, our life as a nation, our nationalism is an ultimate goal, right? It is the end that justifies all means, our survival here, right? To survive, we could justify any means to justify that end. People who set that as the end, he says, are assimilating. They are assimilating while speaking Hebrew. In other words, they might be speaking Zionism, but it's actually not the Jewish view of nationalism, which I think fits very well with what Rav Amiel suggested.
Hi.
Rav Avidan, good to see you, and thank you for this. The quote that you had from Tzvi Hirsch-Kalischer about where he imagined change was going to come from is interesting to me, because he was talking. It sounded, if I understood him right, is he's talking about leveraging the super wealthy's money in order to sort of underwrite everything that needs to happen for the state. But I'm curious. To me, that's just moving the power from easily observable and violence done like very sort of explicitly, to the violence sort of done by the way that people get that much money, right? And it's just sort of like taking advantage of that sort of money to underwrite the state. And I wonder if you just have anything to say about it.
It's a very interesting point. I mean, in the end, or at the beginning, that is really how it happened, right? You really did have these super wealthy Jews who were buying up swaths of land, so that other, much less wealthy Jews could go and live in them and create the settlements. Um, and I don't know, I hear your concerns about the potential for evils. I don't know if those concerns really played out within, in the the 19th and early 20th century. Um, not that I am aware of that, I think there were issues of power and control, but the kind of in the darker ways that you're intimating, I don't think it really did. And it did work out that way, that people bought these lands and people came and worked them, and that created the core of the settlements. But I do, obviously, as somebody who is an activist against Israeli weapons exports and asks moral questions about what it means for a lot of money to be coming into Israel from people who are making it by supporting killing, supporting world regimes, and what that means. So I appreciate the question. As a broader question we need to be asking ourselves.
Freedman, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to learn with you, and thank you all for joining as well. Our next class will be on September 19th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. What is Jewish spirituality and why is it vital for the Jewish present and future, with Rabbi Dr. Josh Fagelson. So we hope you can all join us for that as well. And thank you again for being here. Have a good day.
Thank you all so much. May we hear good news and have better days.